Let me show you why the 1900s is far from boring. In 1901, Edmund Barton sent a spy to Vanuatu. Back then it was called New Hebrides, and it was split between France and Britain. The spy was to report back with news on whether or not France planned on kicking Britain out. He requested a gun for safety, but Barton himself denied the request. Really, Barton was the government. He wasn't just Prime Minister. He'd also written the Constitution, and with no ASIO, he was personally responsible for every spy. But this left a huge question. What would happen when he left? Well, in 1903, we found out. Lacking Barton's aura, his replacement, Alfred Deakin, called for a snap election, hoping it'd give him total control of Parliament. But what he got instead was chaos. His party only picked up 2 more seats than Labour, and they actually got the exact same amount as their rivals, the Free Traders. As England were down here for the Ashes, Deakin had his perfect analogy. How can you play cricket with 3 11s? It was simple. One of those parties had to go. So the election is just a few weeks away, and there's a very real chance we'll end up in minority government. Essentially, in this scenario, one of the majors will have to do a deal and give concessions to a minor party in order to govern. The majors absolutely hate this. David Cameron, Theresa May, Jacinta Ardern, and Julia Gillard have at one point all relied on the support of a third party. The criticism of minority government goes like this. Minor parties push mainstream parties to the fringes because they don't need to appeal to a majority of people. They hold the government hostage and, by doing so, hand victory to the opposition. And in 1903, Alfred Deakin had to deal with this exact issue. You see, his party, the Protectionists, and the opposition party, the Free Traders, were literally antonyms. They'd drawn the battle lines on opposite sides of the same issue. One wanted no taxes on imports, and the other wanted to protect local industry by taxing imports. So there was no way that those two could form a government. They literally advocate for the exact opposite cause. And in 1903, tensions between the two parties had come to a head. We've got to remember that in the early 1900s, Australia had nothing to handle anything on a national level. I mean, we hadn't even built Canberra yet. So Barton had first proposed a national court to deal with all of Australia's workplace disputes on things like pay, conditions, working hours, and so forth. The issue was that these guys didn't think it should even exist because they believed the free market should decide everything. While these guys over here believed that the court should be really powerful. So Barton wanted a compromise court with restricted powers. Unfortunately, some in his own party, like the former Premier of Australia, Charles Kingston, actually believed that this was backing down to the enemy, and he resigned from Barton's cabinet. When Barton resigned, Deakin actually hoped for a strong majority so that he could pass the bill. But the move backfired, with the Radicals now gaining such a strong vote that they were no longer even really a minority party. Deakin was well and truly up the creek, and he had 2 choices. Negotiate with one group of terrorists and introduce a court that would be very pro-worker, or side with his ideological enemy. But what if there was a third option? One that might seem like suicide in the short term, but actually might work out in the long term. You see, Labor were a thorn in Deakin's side because they pushed his party to the fringes. As far as he was concerned, they had no interest in governing a majority, but just lobbied for one sect of society. In other words, they were only effective as deputies and not as leaders. So in 1904, Deakin was like, what if, and this will seem crazy, but what if I took my protectionists and said to Labor, you guys govern and do so with our support. Go on, have a go at passing the bill. So having failed with his first gamble, Deakin took an even bigger one to submit his party to the leadership of Labor's Chris Watson. In giving up the top job, he hoped to show Labor just how annoying a whiny minor party could be. Not gonna lie, it's kind of baller. So in a very weird sequence of events, i.e. Deakin rage quitting, Chris Watson had become the first Labor-affiliated Prime Minister in the whole world. Now it was his turn to try and start the court, and he introduced his own conciliation and arbitration bill. Deakin promised that he'd extend the utmost fair play to Watson as he sought to pass the bill. He lied. Watson definitely played bad politics and promised a much more powerful court that even had authority over state government employees. But if he wanted to pass it, he now needed Deakin to give it the green light. Deakin basically said, yeah, could do, but nah. Watson was livid. Deakin had agreed to govern in a loose coalition with him, but was now blocking his signature bill. Deakin's point was, yeah, it kind of sucks when the minority partner throws their weight around, right? So Deakin had made his point to Labor. You can't play cricket with 3 11s. Watson resigned as Prime Minister and it got ugly. Future Labor Prime Minister Billy Hughes called Deakin a traitor, and Deakin responded by calling Hughes an ill-bred urchin one saw dragged from a tart shop, kicking, screeching and scratching. I'm assuming that was a sick burn for the 1900s. But in 1904, we now had no Prime Minister because none of the three could agree on the bloody court. There was just no way that the free traders and the protectionists could fuse because they had entirely different views on trade. However, they could form a short-term alliance to just introduce this court and then not touch trade for the time being. Now, I did say before that Reid was against the court, but he was also a realist. He knew that one day Labor and the protectionists would patch things up and get it all sorted. So if he acted now, he could implement the court on his terms. But why would Deakin go for this? After all, Watson had resigned, so maybe he could negotiate with Labor and become the Prime Minister again. Well, Deakin wasn't done punishing Labor. If ever they got back together, he wanted them to know how badly they'd messed up as junior partners. If Deakin had sided with their enemy, even for just a couple of months, it would send a very clear message that Labor had committed a grievous sin and could not repeat that mistake. So ironically, it was George Reid who passed the Court of Conciliation and Arbitration, but he knew that he wouldn't be Prime Minister for long. As 1905 rolled around, many protectionists were pushing Deakin to pull the trigger on Reid and to go back to their ex. Deakin held. However, what the public didn't know was that Watson came to him saying that they would give him unquestioned loyalty and support him as Prime Minister. In June, Deakin made his move. Speaking to his home crowd of Ballarat, he accused Reid of breaking their truce on trade as he proposed reducing tariffs in his upcoming budget. Reid interpreted this as Deakin pulling his support away and requested an early election to sort out all the chaos. After all, none of the three had been able to sustain a government. However, the Governor-General refused and Deakin pounced, claiming that the protectionists and Labor had gotten back together, this time for good. So this was in 1905, and remember those comments about Billy Hughes? Yeah, a little bit awkward now that they were back on the same team. But 4 years later, that tension got 10 times worse. Hughes actually went on to say this about Deakin. I hear on my side of the house some mention of Judas. I do not agree with that. It is not fair to Judas. He did not gag the man he betrayed, and he did not fail to hang himself afterwards. That's a pretty big accusation. He's essentially called Deakin a more dishonorable traitor than the one who betrayed Jesus. So what's he talking about? Well, what he was referencing was Deakin creating the Liberal Party. So how did we go from Deakin getting back together with Labor to a divorce that was 10 times worse than the first one? By the way, definitely don't look up Billy Hughes. He's a perfectly consistent guy and never ever joined the dark side. Just trust me on that. But Labor and Deakin initially had a very happy marriage. Now that the court was established, Labor and the protectionists were fine playing nice with each other. For instance, in 1906, Deakin gave the court more powers to enforce wage agreements, and in 1908 introduced a pension. Labor then agreed to support tariffs such as a 25% tax on imported fabrics and a 20% one on farming equipment. Not only that, but in 1906, Deakin actually polled so badly that they held just 16 out of 75 seats, the lowest of the three big players. Labor picked up 26 seats, but Watson was so happy with the arrangement that despite having nearly doubled the seats, he once again submitted to the leadership of Deakin. And these brief few years of stability were objectively good for the nation. In 1907, Deakin ordered the construction of huge projects like the East to West Railway. In the same year, he voiced his support for the Harvester Judgment, which established a legal minimum wage. And then after that, Deakin started to act independent of Britain. When Britain helped Japan industrialise in the 1800s, he felt that they were being a tad cavalier about the damage that they could do in the Pacific. I mean, history showed that that was a pretty fair call from Deaks. So to project strength, Deakin reached out to America and got Teddy Roosevelt to send his Great White Naval Fleet along the eastern coast of Australia. The public loved this, and Watson and Deakin was seemingly a dream team. Australia was really positioning itself as a country who protected workers and who was also happy to slow down economic growth to protect its industries. However, there was a clear loser to this type of Australia: merchants. And by that I mean anyone who imported large amounts of goods for resale. I'm talking businesses like David Jones and Meyer, but also the now defunct but then much bigger Anthony Horton and Sons and Foy and Gibson. Deakin's taxes really hiked up their costs, Watson's push for better wages hiked up their costs, and all these tariffs were resulting in higher prices across the board, which meant that their customers had less to spend at their businesses. In other words, Deakin was suppressing consumer demand for their goods. Now, on the surface, George Reid was a good candidate to lobby for their interests. He was known as the best orator in the empire, and to put it crudely, had good Scottish riz. He also rebranded the Free Traders to be called the Anti-Socialist Party. But despite people liking George Reid, Deakin and Watson were delivering results to a broader cross-section of society. Workers were represented by Labour, and half of the business owners liked Deakin for propping them up with tariffs. If the merchants wanted to have any chance of the rules being in their favour, they needed to break up Watson and Deakin. By the way, my real name's Cam, and I'm a history teacher who traded the classroom for YouTube. When I was in year 9, my history teacher literally said, all you need to know is that we federated in 1900. I mean, that's the question for the test. No one here cares for it. I don't care for it. Let's just get to World War I. So if you're sitting there thinking, damn, this actually isn't that boring, and I feel like I should actually know this stuff, that is literally how I felt even as a history teacher. But if I were to use one word to describe my journey to learning Australian history, it'd be the word inefficient. There's plenty of good stuff out there, but it's usually held quite deep into thick books. And as much as I'm an apologist for Australian history being cool, I know you're not going to go read a book. I mean, you have a job, I assume. But what if there was a hub where every month a different part of Australian history was broken down into modules that took just a couple of hours to complete? Imagine if you could efficiently gain from my inefficient work to learn Australian history. The think tank is exactly that. If you're interested, there's literally a 60-second application in the description, and I myself will get in touch with you within a day. Definitely pause the video right now and do it. Oh, by the way, members get a bonus 10 hours of material on the first 10 Prime Ministers, so if you're liking this video, you can get way more on this specific era. Anyway, in 1907, the first chink emerged in Watson and Deakin's armour. Watson's health was deteriorating, and he was only 40 with a young daughter. He made the call to resign, and in his wake came this guy, Andrew Fisher. Look at how goated his moustache is all throughout his career. And Fisher was hardcore. He was a coal miner from Scotland who then moved to Gympie. If you're from the Sunshine Coast, you know what I'm talking about. And sorry for being crude here, but Fisher felt that Watson was simply being cuckolded by Deakin. Deakin had never drawn a formal coalition agreement, and Labor held no cabinet posts despite holding 10 more seats. Fisher basically said that Labor should know its own worth. If anyone was being an over-demanding minor party, it was the protectionists who felt that they should govern with just 16 out of 75 seats. So Fisher began a campaign of making bolder and bolder demands to Deakin. In 1908, he encouraged Deakin to have the government take over any monopoly. When Deakin planned to delay the pension for budget constraints, Fisher told him, tough luck, pay up. And then when Deakin negotiated with Britain to have its navy patrol Australia, Fisher told him to grow a pair and instead build an Australian navy. Deakin refused. Frustrated with how Deakin was treating Labor, Fisher actually withdrew their support, forcing the resignation of Deakin as Prime Minister. If you look at Parliament, Labor didn't have enough to form a government themselves, but they were so close that they could reach out to the crossbench and possibly persuade some disgruntled protectionists to help pass their laws. At best, it was going to be a very weak government. And this was the same Deakin who had earlier had a fling with the enemy to teach his ex a lesson. He didn't exactly have a reputation to let bygones be bygones. When Fisher proposed an Australian Navy, Deakin virulently spoke out against it in Parliament for being premature and costly. Once again, it appeared that we had 311s and that we would need new elections to resolve this. But this would be especially dangerous for the business class. Australia had grown weary of rotating governments, and with Labor getting close to forming their own government, there was a very real chance that they could pick up the 12 seats that was needed to form a majority in of themselves. If this happened, it didn't really matter whether your business benefited from tariffs or suffered from them, because your wage bill could possibly go through the roof. Of course, Labor would lobby for higher wages, but it wasn't just that. Fisher proposed a progressive land tax. In other words, the more land you own, the more tax you paid. The massive farming conglomerate, the Australian Agricultural Company, publicly said that Fisher was targeting them specifically. As overseas exporters, they never liked Deakin because his tariffs were provoking countries to retaliate with their own tariffs, but he never proposed something as costly to them as Fisher's land tax. This was really bad for them, and they were almost getting nostalgic for Deakin. However, the public loved this. The top 1% owned about 5.48% of Australians' wealth, which is insane compared to America's 18%, and Britain's 69%. Of course, Labor can't take all the credit for this gulf. Britain was dealing with the hangover of feudal society and then relinquishing that land, but the point still stands. We had a very even society and people loved it. As new elections loomed, for the majority, Labor was just a logical choice. It was in most people's interests, and they were the closest to forming a government. The business class urgently needed a new arrangement before the election. And so do we. We are so close to cracking the top 10 history podcasts in Australia. Get in there, hit follow, and give us a rating. Those two things decide the rankings. So the only way that Labor could be stopped was for Deakin and Reid to once again rekindle their 1904 summer of love. However, there was a couple of reasons as to why this would be really difficult. For starters, they still disagreed on tariffs, and Deakin had pulled the rug out from Reid for breaking the truce in 1905. However, given that Reid had redrawn the battle lines away from tariffs and towards pure capitalism, there was now more wiggle room for him to work with. The anti-socialists were closer to being the antonym of Labor rather than the antonym of the protectionists. But even if that could be resolved, Deakin and Reid had to deal with the fact that neither of them liked each other on a personal level. Deakin was from Fitzroy, Reid was from Scotland. For Deakin, Reid was too crude, and for Reid, Deakin was too pompous. George Reid was basically a stand-up comic in Parliament. For instance, given his rather large figure, one time he was asked what he was going to call the baby. Reid's response was, if it's a boy, I'll call it after myself. If it's a girl, I'll call it Victoria. But if, as I strongly suspect, it's nothing but piss and wind, I'll name it after you. My point being that Reid was always sarcastic towards Deakin in the chamber, and as a bit of a sensitive soul, it seemed like it really did get under Deakin's skin. Now, obviously, the business class had much bigger fish to fry than personal spats, and many were crying out for the two to put aside their beef and to team up to stop Labor. And this is where Deakin engineered his last big political move. Laying down his pride, Deakin secretly met with Reid to plan a new coalition of anti-Labor forces to seize the government before the election. But this group would be far more powerful than the 1904 one. In highly secret negotiations that Fisher wasn't aware of, Deakin and Reid nutted out the final details. It went like this. Deakin would get the leadership, but only on the condition that the anti-socialists get to stack the cabinet with their guys. While Fisher was aware that something was going on, he didn't know what. After all, Reid and Deakin did hate each other. David Day, an Aussie historian, actually makes the argument that Fisher didn't bother with a counter-strategy like requesting an early election because he simply didn't think that the two could ever get their ducks in order. So imagine the shock of Fisher walking into Parliament in 1909, only to see that Deakin had tabled a vote of no confidence in his leadership. I mean, that itself had happened before. But imagine the shock of then finding out that the protectionists and the anti-socialists weren't just going to form a coalition, they were actually going to fuse into one singular party. They literally adopted the name the Fusion Party to show that their past differences had been cast aside, and now they had 42 seats to become the first majority government in federated history. Deakin was back as Prime Minister, and Labor was outraged. By siding with Reid, he seemingly betrayed everything that he had stood for during his new protection era, and those famous hisses of Judas echoed in the chamber. As for Reid, he actually couldn't stomach serving under Deakin, and he resigned. This meant that the anti-socialist faction of Fusion needed a new leader, and they chose Joseph Cook, someone who actually used to be a Labor guy. He got on far better with Deakin than Reid did, and it helped create an image of a new party rather than just a marriage of convenience. But Deakin and Cook knew that they needed to go further. For the first time in Australian history, the 1910 election was shaping up to be a two-horse race. On the one hand, there was the party that had a clear identity and stood for something, and on the other was Fusion, a name which literally insinuated a compromise on core beliefs. The Fusion name may have been effective in showing the new closeness of the two former enemies, but they knew that it couldn't stick. A decade before, the battle lines of major political parties were drawn upon trade. But Labor had become such a potent force, campaigning on a whole different battle line: workers' rights. The reality was that the anti-socialists and protectionists had only merged to stop Labor, so their name had to be something that stood in direct opposition to the Labor Party. Cook himself had once served in the Labor Party, so he was actually in a perfect position to find a name that captured his experience of why he left. His big gripe was that they acted as a militant bloc. Labor would first have their own internal debate called caucus, and then once it was settled, no matter how you personally felt, everyone in Labor had to vote together to be a potent force in Parliament. Cook not only felt that individual liberty was restricted in the party, but then also felt that they restricted the economic liberty of businesses by mandating much stricter minimum conditions to employees than the rest of the world. So what was to be Fusion's new name? Well, it became the Commonwealth Liberal Party. Congratulations, you just did a decade of Australian history featuring 5 prime ministers, and dare I say, I think you had fun while doing it. Now, at this point, I can already see commenters saying that Menzies started the Liberal Party rather than Deakin, and my answer to that is not really. The Commonwealth Liberal Party would later merge with disgruntled Labour MPs and go by other names like the Nationalist Party and the United Australia Party, of which Menzies was actually a part of before he revived the old name, the Liberal Party. One of those Labour guys who actually defected was Billy Hughes himself. Yeah. After calling Deakin worse than Judas for making the Liberal Party, he then went and joined it during World War I when he was the Prime Minister. It's a wild story that gives you a better understanding of the Liberal Party. You also find out the outcome of that first Labour-Liberal election. Click right here.